The story of the carbon landscape. This story was written by peat cutters and farmers. It was dreamt of by glaciers and carved out by rivers. It doesn't think too highly of itself. It isn't complicated. It was told very softly by orchids and mosses by firelight in terraces. It was shouted by crowds on Petersfield. There are Romans lost in this story, a Viking horde, because this is a story of war, of fire in the sky at night, of survival. It is spoken in many languages: fox scream and traffic, bad weather and linnet. It doesn't mind if you fidget or are distracted. It wants you to stare at the moon, to be held, to have a good time with your friends. Sometimes it rhymes, so you'll sing it, so you'll remember it all of your life. Because this is a story and you are in it. Perhaps you're a wall, stone silent. Perhaps you're a ranger. You might suddenly appear as a hare. Your part might be small, but it could be pivotal. Maybe you are a rare insect, a bird. Maybe someone will save you. Perhaps you are a treasure, a spider. Perhaps you are peat. Maybe you have been exploited. Perhaps you will be restored. The healing of little Woolden moss. There's beauty in what is repaired, in old wrongs softened, in moss and all of its colours. Though not everything can be restored, there are dragonflies, and their wings are bright windows, they lift you. Here, healing is still in progress, and it sounds like summer. It is skylark and curlew, buzzard, the wide sky where all things are possible, and the earth, which holds its stories within it and tells them through curve and ditch. Because this is a place of purpose, where hard work unmakes mistakes, and though the ground is unstable, it is soft, and a man will stand here for hours to name the birds. And where once there were wounds, there are scars, and they shimmer. And in summer, the swallows and swifts will return. Brown hair. All hail the hair, the strength of her stillness, the muscle and fire in the length of her haunches, a flare from the long grass, all power, all ear, racing and boxing, half mad with desire. Let's hear it for hair, outgunning the car, outrunning the farmer, as rapid as river, swifter than motorway, bumper to bumper, quicker than progress and fleeter than fear. Flushed out and hunted by poacher and hunger, the bullet and buzzard, the lurcher and lamper, the truth of the hair, here in muscle and amber, the flame of her eye, still burning, still running, back to old Lancashire, back to the grasses, a million or more running faster than foxes, back over centuries, back to the mosses, dear quarry, rewriting her story, all glory. How to open a door to a secret world. Maybe you've seen it every day, or never noticed it. It might look like a gap in a hedge, a dirt track. Might be a path in a patch of brambles you've always ignored before. Perhaps it's behind the shops, or in your memory. You don't need a key or a code. There isn't a guard. Step in. The air is different in here. The birdsong is louder. The years don't matter at all. You can forget yourself. You can remember how once you were a creature in a book. You were magic. Trees tell you all of their secrets. Dragonflies swoop around and inside you. There are dark miles beneath you, a vast space above you. The river within you runs calm. Now when you go home, take this with you. Let the seeds in your chest burst into flower. Let the sky inside your head be very blue. Lockdown in Wigan and Leigh. When the traffic stopped, birds started. There were owls in the darkness. Birds woke us early with the sun. They told us we were not alone. The sky was bigger than we'd remembered, and very blue. Then the parks became meadows. There were flowers. The gulls sang a memory of ocean, and the magpie shouted, "Stay home." There was suddenly so much time. In the night, we heard foxes scream. When the hospitals filled with our sick, we turned to trees. Oak breathed for us, and the chiff-chaff insisted, "Stay safe." Then we sang from our lonely rooms like the birds, and we felt our hearts break and ease. And the robin was river, and though it was the end of the world, a snail climbed up our window. We watched it. There were seeds on the ledge. We saw them grow. We were used to being afraid. The grass in the cobbles was untroubled, and the wren poured its comfort on the air. There were deer, and the breeze through the door was a memory of wide fields rippling like sea. Poppies shone for our fallen. The pavement was home to clover. Buttercups grew in the cracks. Months passed. Selfield grew tall on the verges, and though the news was a dream we could not wake from, there was pollen, there was nectar, there was bee. What Caddy said taught me about love. That some people don't know it's there, though it's on their doorsteps. That it can be tricky to find, but the paths are well marked. You should keep to them. That there is mystery there, and the water is dark and rich, the flowers are bright, orchids and foxgloves, red campion. Sometimes all you can hear is a bird or a road in the distance. That it can keep its secrets for years and give them up suddenly. There are ghosts, that people are lost there and found. It can knock you breathless, that it has been utterly drained, but it can be mended. What looks like desolation is repair. The cotton grass has returned, that it can save us, that it's closer than you think, that it can grow.
Hello and welcome to today's Manchester Literature Festival event. My name is Helen Mort, I'm a writer and I'm here in conversation with Clare Shaw, a writer whose work I hugely admire, so it's really lovely to get the opportunity to talk. Clare has been Carbon Landscapes Poet in Residence, commissioned by Manchester Literature Festival and the Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and we're going to be talking about that work today. I can't remember when I first discovered your work, Clare, but I've always loved the way you write about people and landscapes, and particularly the north of England, themes that are really dear to me as well and to my writing. Clare has published 3 collections, the most recent of which is Flood, which dealt with the flooding in Hebden Bridge, amongst other themes. And her next collection was going to be published in 2022 towards a general theory of love. That's coming out with Blood Axe. Starting with the residency itself, Claire, what's been the most rewarding part of it, or what did you like most about writing the carbon landscapes, or what are the carbon landscapes? Perhaps we should start there.
You might well ask. I think I'm still figuring it out. I grew up in East Lancashire, which I think may be part of the reason I was selected for this particular residency. The carbon landscapes are in Lancashire, and are largely in the kind of central areas. I've particularly focused on the carbon landscape to the south of Manchester and around Wigan, Leigh, Salford. What are they? It's an area that was largely shaped in the Industrial Revolution, but if you read the history, you're going right back into 350 million years ago when it was first formed. The clue's in the name. It's landscapes that's defined by its relationship with carbon, and we've seen that played out in lots and lots of ways. So it's landscape where there's lots of peat, lots of wetlands, or there were lots of wetlands, and landscapes that have been defined by, for example, mining. It's landscapes that traditionally I've just driven through. So part of what I've loved about it is being invited to engage in a really kind of deep new way with areas of Lancashire that I wasn't even aware were there. I just used to wonder why the M62 went bumpy when you approach Warrington, and it's because it's passing over an old bog. Miles and miles of bog. So what I've loved about the landscape is its wildness and its kind of unexpectedness. But I think most of all it's kind of the way that it's absolutely drenched in history and a particular kind of human history, and a very intense and I think kind of underappreciated and underwritten period of history. So, you know, the last 200 years of Lancashire, and the way that's still being played out in communities and landscapes that are so closely writing and rewriting each other over and over. So my initial feeling about the landscape was a reaction to, oh wow, you know, bogs, peatlands, I didn't know these were here. But over the months it's become a reaction to the human landscape, I think, that you find within those kind of natural settings.
And that's something that I described you at the start, and I probably should have asked if you like being described like that, as a poet of landscapes. But one thing that I always love about your poems is that they're always peopled landscapes as well. There are poems of landscape that sort of pitch it as something else, and of course I love those poems too, but there's something about the kind of inextricable relationship with human life that you always capture really well, and I think that's there in these pieces particularly as they go on, but also the theme of, there's a lot about repair in the poems that you've written as part of the residency, and I'm interested in that really, in repair and how that came into the writing that you were doing.
There are so many points to what you've just said that I think I could talk with passion about for hours. I'm delighted to be called a landscape poet. That's extraordinary to me. I think because I'm so fascinated by the human, it's maybe easy for me to overlook that I do write a lot about place. But now that I think about it, of course, I'm a northern poet to my bones, and we're northern because we're placed. But for me, maybe the kind of landscape that I enjoy writing and the kind of landscape writing that I enjoy reading is about natural landscapes that are in relationship to humans. and the way that those two landscapes form each other. And absolutely, repair comes out over and over and over again as a theme, whether you're visiting the carbon landscapes or writing about them. And I find repair fascinating. Maybe that's one of the things that I've loved so much about the landscapes, is that they are a repaired landscape. And I'm thinking, as I'm speaking, about a book called Strong at the Broken Places that I read decades ago by, I think it's Linda Sanford, and I can't be entirely sure. And it's a book about experiences of trauma and how, rather than viewing people as damaged or weakened by trauma, we can see people as stronger, strong at the broken places. It's using the metaphor of, a human bone that for a period of time anyway is stronger as a result of breaking. It gets this protective cuff around it. And I'm fascinated by psychological processes of repair and recovery and restoration, and absolutely believe that people become deliberately and intentionally and knowingly, consciously stronger and sometimes happier and more fulfilled as a result of going through difficulty. A light is shone on areas of ourselves that we then repair and develop. And to see exactly the same process going on in landscape, in the carbon landscapes, is kind of beautiful. And there's one site in particular that I've written about again and again in the sequence that I came to really love, and it's Little Woolden Moss, and where it meets with Caddishead Moss. So one thing I haven't mentioned is that although we had miles and miles and miles of wetlands and bogs, they are now largely degraded. We lost about 98% of the Lancashire wetlands. But 2% obviously now is intensely important, and places like Lancashire Wildlife Trust are undertaking a process of restoring degraded bogs and peatlands. So if you go to this site, Little Woolden Moss, Caddishead, you can watch that in process. So you watch work that's only begun in the last year, and you watch it going up into a site where that work has been underway for years and years and years. So a work where the process of recovery is very visible, and in some ways fairly challenging to the eye, up to the wetlands that seem like they've been there for thousands of years, that have been restored to that degree, and species have returned. And so back to the question, the repair, I think, shines a spotlight and just makes you feel more passionate and more engaged when you've had to work at something. And the notion that we can undo damage through work, that's a great one, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I was really struck by how, even when you're writing about damage, how sort of hopeful it is, I guess. And there's a nice bit in one of the early pieces where you're talking about, sorry if I'm paraphrasing badly, but no matter how small, your role may be pivotal, and this idea. And I just wondered if that's something that that kind of guides you as a writer, as a person, this idea that I sometimes think that not going as far as, well, maybe I am going as far as sort of Shelley with his unacknowledged legislators of the world as a description of poets, but that poems sort of change the world a little bit at a time, because they change people's outlook. And I felt that was there in these. I wondered if that was something you were aware of.
Oh my God, so much, yeah. You can tell I feel quite strongly about it, because I nearly cry when you ask me that question. I don't think that poetry has to be about social change, but it does for me. If I didn't think that either me writing or me writing with people writing with me, if I didn't think it was going to make things better, I couldn't see the point. And I think that does happen through through lots of stuff. I think it does happen through changing people's outlook. It happens through people being more connected with themselves, with each other, with the world around them. Those things, I cannot but believe that they make the world better, and that they can sometimes have really profound effects. We evidence of that. We see poets in jail for they can be threats to regimes. That's how powerful a poem can be. But absolutely, if we're thinking about the tiny steps that people take, that might be about being kind, that might be about drawing one's attention to something beautiful, that might be about taking one small step to turn off a light. It seems so true to me. I can't imagine it being any other way. That our parts might be small, but that can be pivotal, and that the poet has a role to play in that.
This has just reminded me, it's a total aside, but you once bought me a cake in Hebden Bridge when I was having a really bad day and I really needed it, and that was for me a perfect example of one of those little acts of kindness that makes the world better. It was really lovely. Anyway, but yeah, it's there in the poems as well, and I guess balancing that with how you write about fear as well, because you do evoke, particularly writing about the lockdown and the context of lockdown, which I think is really beautifully expressed in the poems. There's a part where I think one of the poems talks about us becoming accustomed to fear, and a beautiful image of again, nature and social life mimicking each other, people in their rooms becoming a bit like birds who sing to one another across the distance. I wondered what you thought about like writing fear. It made me think of your work in Flood, and how I just remember staying up and reading that collection late into the night, and I kept reading it in the early hours because I would wake up and think, I can't quite leave these poems there. Obviously you were dealing with a natural disaster and its effect on communities and the concept of flood more generally. So fear is there, fear of climate emergency, fear of but it's sort of tempered by the hope and the sense that we can do things as well. I'm not really sure what my question is there. I'm just asking you something about writing fear and or writing into fear and how difficult that is.
I'm glad that you haven't asked me a specific question, because I don't think I could answer one, so I'll just say a load of words in response. And do you know what, as you were talking, I thought, oh my God, I was really surprised when he talked about me as a poet of landscape. And then I thought that the last book is purely about place, but Flood is all about, so it's literally, obviously, about the flooding of Hebden Bridge, but it is also a lot about finding metaphors for trauma and kind of psychological damage and recovery. And I guess that's largely what I see when I read it. And again, look into the carbon landscapes, I largely see repair and restoration and recovery and connection. And maybe that kind of writing into fear and writing right back out again, maybe is one of the main reasons that I write. I really like processes that make me feel something. And I really like, I think one of the reasons that I particularly like these landscapes is that they invite you to feel quite deeply. They're not especially soothing, they're quite challenging. And because of those very strong connections with human history, they're a fairly easy metaphor for writing into times of, tremendous difficulty and turmoil, and then into the very effortful sometimes process of recovery. But it does make me reflect on if I look at the kind of trajectory of my works, my first book is 15 years ago now, and that was a book called Straight Ahead, and then the next book was called Head On, the third book was called Flood, and the next book is going to be called Towards a General Theory of Love, and maybe even the titles kind of show that there's been a softening, and maybe in my work I can't help but keep coming back to some of the same issues. So how people go through difficult times and come back out again is fascinating to me, and I think I'll always come back to that. But I'm much more drawn to what we find there that's about connection and love and engagement and beauty. I think that's a part of my story that gets a little bit more light now, and maybe that's what I'm more inclined to see when I look out of the window, or the train window, or the plane window. I don't know where I'm going with the windows, Helen. Help me out in the window metaphor.
I know exactly what you mean about those. Well, I've not engaged with them in the way that you have, but those landscapes, those kind of the landscapes that encourage you to feel deeply. Yeah. I always get that about moorland. There's something, and I have arguments with people that don't like looking at moorland, don't think it's beautiful, because there's something about its relationship to the sky, and sky comes into these poems quite a lot. There's a line that stuck with me, which is about making your mind a very, very blue sky, which I thought was great. I'm going to write that down somewhere on my desk. It's a nice metaphor for life. And I wondered, I suppose thinking about the residency itself, I guess I've done a few writing residencies, usually over a longer period of time maybe, or a shorter one, sort of like a day residency or a year residency. But do you think, and I'm never quite sure if the work that I produce is, it feels different from my other poetry. You can still tell it's me, but there's something, and I wondered if that's similar for you. Is there something, does engagement with a place or a residency like this one change the way you write in a particular way, do you think?
I think oh God, that's such an interesting question. I'm really fascinated in how you've just said change the way you write, not what you write. Oh, I'll have to give that more thought. But while this bit of my mind is thinking, this bit of my mind is going to tell you, it definitely changed what I wrote. I think, yeah, I'm really super aware of that the poetry I would have written, on the basis of just popping along to the landscapes to have a look round and writing a poem based on what I saw, would have been profoundly different to what I ended up writing, kind of 2 or 3 months down the line. So the residency kind of extended over a couple of summer months. And it's something to do with depth, engagement, something to do with the process. So from that initial visit, which was to Little Woolden Moss and Cadishead, where I would have written about, potentially something about restoration, and I would have written about the dragonflies and hares and midges and cotton grass and skies. So that would have come into it, but something to do with the kind of archaeology and the strata and just how deeply you can sink. And it's also very much to do with engagement. So I visited sites over and over again, and obviously that allows you to embed yourself much more deeply into a landscape. But also it was very much about engagement with human community, and I worked with several groups in Leigh in particular, and a gallery in Leigh, and several organisations in the local area, but particularly meeting and working with local people and the mining museum at Astley, and speaking to ex-miners and children of miners, and hanging out with people on freezing cold Sunday mornings, and going to events and memorials and listening to people sing. I think if you work as a freelance writer, I can get used to the idea that engagement is about getting other people to engage either with what I'm writing or to engage with the task of writing. And a residency reminds me that engagement is both ways, and that what I write is very different when I listen to other people, and that what they give me, not just in terms of kind of knowledge and facts, but just culture and feeling and accents. I mean, the accent of that area, Lee, it is really different to Wigan, and there's no way of knowing or capturing that until you're in it and walking around it. That's what, though, and I haven't answered the question of how the actual form and structure of the writing, and I think that's something that I'm going to have to think about over the long term. I love that idea of, you know, words as kind of like shovels and tools and implements, and you've just invited me to think what I was digging up was different as a result of the residency, but actually I think the tools are shaped differently, and the way that we use them looks different, and maybe that's going to take a little bit more thought. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I love what you said about accent as well, and the effect of talking to people. And exactly, I really identify with that thing about you sort of think mostly of engagement as being about poems and them as a sort of outcome, but then something else can happen in the process. And I think sometimes if you're listening to people quite a lot, then even the accent and the sounds of it sort of gets into the poems in a funny kind of way, or it kind of shapes it. And I love the poems that were group poems that have been written with some of the writers in Lee and in Wigan. They worked so well as a collective expression. There was some gorgeous lines in them, and I guess I'm interested in what you would want the legacy of having done this. That's a hard question to ask a writer, because it's sort of saying, look into the future, what would you want the legacy of this to be? But in terms of how people see the carbon landscapes, maybe, or the legacy for your own work as well, maybe, if it has changed.
Oh, wow. I was thinking maybe a little bit of world domination.
Yeah.
That would be nice. Maybe laureateship, Booker Prize. Accent, I've just got to say, it was such a central concern for me in writing that sequence, that I really, really want to capture something of the accent, and that's why a couple of the songs have been set to music, because in the end of that, I don't have that accent, and if I try to, I'm not going to be able to capture it. I read the dialect poetry, that wasn't working either, you know, the kind of colloquialisms and it just sounded forced, and I thought, if we set this to music, there's some fantastic folk in the area. Mary Hell, a Wigan band, and Corrie Shelley, a local musician. Corrie's worked to set some of the poetry to music, and just capturing the sound of the landscape. And I think folk music has a really interesting relationship with landscape, but that's maybe for another conversation. I want the legacy of the residency. Well, it won't leave me. You know, I came from East Lancashire. I came from an area of moorland and mining. I hadn't engaged with that area of Lancashire before, and I have now, and it won't leave me. And I feel like I've returned a little bit more to Lancashire. I've lived in West Yorkshire for a good couple of decades, and I feel very rooted in Yorkshire, but it's been fantastic to remember that I come from Lancashire, and that makes a difference, and I think I'd forgotten that it made a difference, and I'm glad that it makes a difference. I've taken my daughter there over the summer, and she wants to move there. She wants to move to like Astley and Lee. She loved it that much. I was at a meeting yesterday with Natural England, where local people in the area, along with the Carbon Trust and Lancashire Wildlife Trust, are trying to get a national nature reserve status for the carbon landscapes, and we are presenting parts of the landscape to the directors and the CEOs of Natural England, and I want them to be aware that art is a really effective tool. Poetry is a really effective tool for social change. And it's about connecting not just facts and knowledge we can all have access to, but connecting people to landscape and to feeling and to the meaning of that landscape, I think is something that poetry does really well. And I guess for the landscape and the people of the area, maybe just what we said earlier, that when people connect with themselves and connect with each other and connect with the landscape, it will always make things a bit better. And that's what maybe, I hope, is the legacy of the project. People just that little bit more connected.
My dad's from Lancashire and I'm from Yorkshire. Well, I was born in Sheffield, so he would be so delighted if he's listening. He'd be so delighted to hear you saying that you've kind of reattached to your Lancashire identity. It's still a thing, isn't it? The Yorkshire-Lancashire thing, it never goes away.
It's the strangest thing. I just shuffled across the border from Burnley to West Yorkshire, and that felt like it made all the difference. And now I'm kind of creeping back again and going, do you know what? This is where I'm from. This is where my roots are from. And I'm gonna wear that and own that more than I've done for a while now.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thanks for responding to my big questions. All of the poems that Claire performed at the start of this event, plus some others, will be available to download as a free PDF from the Manchester Literature Festival website. So do check those out afterwards. They're fantastic poems. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.